All right, welcome students. If you are here, that means you already got some tasks done, and the tasks so far that you're supposed to do, this is going to be the lecture. It shouldn't take too long. It's kind of a short chapter, but before you look at this and before you watch this, make sure you get done with your reading guide section 1. It's like 5 questions and maybe 2 vocab words or something, or 3 vocab words, so it's pretty easy. But I wanted to go over a couple things, and this is going to go a little bit more, so you hear it twice, you read it once, and then you see it from me and watch it on the slides here. So first off, the thing I want to kind of like point out is right up here. It's called the compelling question. So the compelling question is the question that's like the big idea of the chapter that I want you to think about. And ironically, the compelling question for this Chapter 1 is actually the section 1, the name of section 1. So the compelling question is called Why Study Psychology. So what I want you to do with the compelling question throughout it is each time we do a section, I want you to think about that question. So can you use information from that section to help, like, why is it important to study psychology? Okay, so that's the big question. It's not just like, oh, it's important because we want to know behavior. No, think about absolutely everything that was talked about in section 1 that you could like construct an argument for. And then also when we talk about section 3 and section 4, I want you to think about why should we study psychology based on everything that we kind of will know. Now, each time you do a reading guide, it's on the bottom of your reading guide, the why, the big compelling question. I want you to answer that. So after you do section 1, I want you to answer, and you can watch this, then I want you to answer that compelling question. Because I want you to, like, based on what I have now, I answer that question. And then for the next section 3, you do the same thing. So you use section 3 and section 1. So enough with me talking. I want to keep going forward so that way this isn't too long for you, okay? But anyway, let's start. First off, we're talking about why study psychology. So section 1 of this chapter is that question, why are we studying psychology? So this is going to go in a little bit about what is psychology and everything like that, okay? So the main thing we're looking at, I want you to think about that question, but we're just going to look at the goals and explain psychology as a science. What is it? How do we find out, how do we, these goals, how do we kind of like help people with anxiety and things like that? And we'll talk about that here, okay? So the first thing I want to talk about is what is psychology? Okay, so psychology is pretty simple. It's the scientific study and behavior of mental processes. All right, so what we're looking at big is the behavior. So why do people behave a certain way? Why do things happen to our body in certain maybe times? So for example, like if I was to public speak, or maybe you were to public speak in front of someone, you get like you start sweating, you start your voice starts trembling. Why does that happen? So we're going to study that situation. We're going to study you and understand why that's happening. Okay, so that's just pretty much. And then also the behavior. Why do people have abnormal? Why do people have like an abnormal disorder, mental disorder, or why do we have, why do people make decisions at certain times? So that's all about behavior. Okay, and we'll kind of talk about that. And behavior does include a couple of different things. So when we're talking about behavior, we're going to be talking about how it includes like your heart rate, your blood pressure, your body functions, all those types of things. Your digestion, brain activity, that goes into all your behavior and mental processes. So behavior is pretty simple. It's any action or other people can observe or measure. So that's kind of what I was saying with behavior before. It is the body functions that you have, automatic body functions that you have no control over. Okay, so like I said, heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, brain activity, anything like that could be considered. Sleeping, walking, drinking, eating, all that is a behavior. Okay, so I kind of have it down there, examples of what that would be. Okay, next thing I kind of want to talk about that it goes into is cognitive activity. So that's another thing that we look at is like any private mental processes. So any like perceptions, thoughts, problem solving, the way that your brain kind of works is very interesting. So psychiatrists are actually very interested in studying your emotions and your feelings. And we look at how these both affect our behavior and our mental processes. So, for example, you might have anxiety when you think about presenting. Well, why is that? Something's going on mentally that you think of that. You're just thinking mentally of doing it, and then you start feeling anxiety. You start sweating, trembling, all those things. Okay, so those are considered cognitive activities, so private, unobservable mental processes. So something that we can't necessarily observe, but something that's happening. All right. So a lot of times, like the way people try to look at your thoughts, Sigmund Freud we'll learn about a little bit later, but he does a big thing like when you're sleeping, your dreams, look at your dreams, and those are your cognitive, what you're actually thinking. All right. So I'm going to keep moving forward. That's just a question you can kind of think of how would psychiatrists measure this type of behavior. So we'll keep moving forward. All right, so the next thing you don't really have to know much about, but I just want to kind of say it to you and kind of talk to you about it. What we're looking at is psychological constructs, and what these are just the idea of where we can theoretical concepts, so something that we can discuss, but something that we cannot touch or measure directly. Okay, so the human behavior, not every time can we like touch the human behavior and understand it. All right. And at the end of the day, psychiatrists, what we're doing is we're worrying about your emotions and feelings. Think about it. You can't touch feelings and you can't touch emotions. So these are constructs that they're trying to understand. So understand why people have certain emotions or feelings when things are going on. All right. So the biggest thing that in psychology that people have, you need to know this, make sure you understand this, is the goals of psychology. Okay, the goals are you try to observe what's going on. Okay, I'll use this one as an example. Okay, Alex Rodriguez back in 2002 or 3, he actually went to New York and he was having trouble hitting. I mean, just like was struggling real bad. He was getting bad anxiety because the fans were kind of starting to turn on him and stuff like that. So he started observing this behavior. Next, he's trying to describe it. So you observe it, then describe what's trying to happen. Okay, what's happening at this time. So describe the behavior. Then you try to explain why that's happening. Okay, well, we had a tough first couple months. He's been having trouble, and the anxiety, and now he can't hit the ball. Okay, and then we have to predict. So we have to predict why or when it's going to happen again. So that's a big one. Predict when it's going to happen again. Okay, so think about that predicting and the idea of in what situations do you have anxiety? All right, hopefully that kind of makes sense. And then control it. So maybe he sees a sports psychologist or anything like that, but you try to control that behavior so that way it diminishes that anxiety a little bit. So we're trying to change this behavior by understanding the factors that change humans' behavior. Okay, so just like I said, this is a good real-life example of anxiety. Anyone with anxiety. I mean, if you have trouble speech or like speaking in front of people, there's many people who are high up in the business world that have hired, speech coaches, but then also psychiatrists that help him or help them with, trying to speak. So that's just one thing. So this is big. So ODPEC is a way that I like to think. It goes to psychology. It's observe, describe the behavior, try to explain it, predict it, and then can we control it? Okay, and psychology is actually considered a social science, okay, but it does have some foundations in natural sciences, like, of course, because we're talking about the brain and different things like that, okay, so we will be talking about those things when how chemistry and biology does kind of fall into psychology a little bit, okay? So what we're kind of looking at is they're always trying to answer the question if you're talking about like natural sciences, okay? Those psychiatrists that we seek to answer those questions that involve scientific research. So they're still using scientific research to try to figure out or answer any questions. So that's how it kind of falls under the natural sciences that it goes with too, okay? So how do we find those answers, right? So they're trying to scientifically find answers to questions. So pretty simple research. They do surveys, experiments, analyze any data from that, and then try to draw conclusions. So come up with a theory, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit more. All right, so with the research, there's two that are very important that you need to know, okay? So the first one is surveys, and the second one we're talking about is experiments. So survey is a method of collecting data. So you guys have probably taken surveys before. I know we just handed one out at school about what are your triggers, right? So we're looking at that and like what triggers a student in our building. So that's a great way to collect data, and it's usually asking questions, so that way we can see how people react in school. So what are the things that majority of the people or some people that trigger them in school, and how can we fix that, right? So a lot of times that survey to try to predict and understand. So in this point, trying to understand what triggers people, so that way we stop that, right? So that's one. And the other one is, of course, experiments. So experiments can be on humans, they can be on animals, okay? A lot of times with humans, they're going to do more about behavior and things like feelings and empathy and love and those stuff that you really can't get from the animals. But when we're looking at it is, experiments can be as much as some famous ones like Pavlov dog, okay, or Little Albert, or the Stanford prison experiment. Those are all pretty big ones to see in different situations. How do people act? And how people react and their behavior during those. So those are some big ones that we will talk about a little bit more. All right, and then with that testing, what do they do with that surveys, and what do they do with the experiment? So they come up with a theory. I mean, at the end of the day, if you guys might have heard what theory means, but theory is like a statement we're trying to attempt and explain why things are the way they are. Like, why do people act a certain way? And theories are not set in stone. These are not things that like, oh, this is straight up, this is science. No, theories are ideas, and all different psychiatrists have, or psychology, people who study psychology have different ways or different theories about different situations, okay? I mean, Freud, we'll talk about him later on, his theories are nuts, okay? Some of them are very crazy, but some of them still have some of them have been debunked, but some of them are still around now. And if we see like, oh, this theory no longer is validated, but sometimes people do build off those theories. So theory is just an attempt that people like do a study experiment, and then they try to explain like, well, I think it's because of, they act like this because of this type of thing. So explain why things are happening. And then the other thing that is like the principle. The principle is like, no, this is the rule. This is set in stone. Okay, so sometimes you can find that in, experiments and surveys. Like, this is the rule. So that's the principle. And the thing about it is, all this time they're trying to do these theories, and these principles are all trying to be useful to allow us to predict behavior still, okay, in our mental processes. Okay, so for example, a principle would be like things that are very, here's an example, like a principle. If you study, then you will get better and better grades, right? Like, it's not just gonna happen. That's a rule. I mean, that the more you study, the better you're gonna do. That is a principle. That is a rule of law. We already know that. All right, so that's done. I'm done. I got about 13 minutes in, but what I want you to do, if you didn't do it yet, I want you to answer the question that is, what is psychology? And then, why study psychology? So the what is psychology is that simple one, like right here, what is it? So you could talk about simply what is psychology. And then based off what we did so far, I want you to think about the situations I talked about, or the situations in the book of why study psychology. Okay, so answer those on those sheet, and make sure you turn this in. Okay, turn in that reading guide with everything filled out. You should be good. If you have any questions, let me know. Peace out.